All right, welcome everybody to Paleo Talks. We are back with a new guest, and our first guest actually coming to us from Germany today. How are you doing, Anneke?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
All right, well, wonderful. Known Anneke for a number of years with our similar interests in bear research, and Dr. Van Heteren is now at a museum and collection in Germany. If you want to tell us a little bit more about where you're at and what you do there.
So I'm in Munich at the Bavarian State Collection of Zoology. It's really not a museum, it's just a collection. And I'm the curator of modern mammals.
All right. Sorry, I apologize. I keep thinking of museums as collections and being the same thing.
They usually are, but in this case, they are not.
Well, before we move further with introductions, we have David Moscato, who is our science communicator, and he will tell us all how the show works again. As a reminder, thanks, David.
Absolutely. Same format as usual. We're going to start with a bit more from our guest and then go right into the presentation. I know Blaine's excited to hear about bears, and bears are an exciting group, so I think everyone will be excited about it. After the presentation, so toward the end of the program, once we are done, we're going to open up the floor to questions. So the latter section of Paleo Talks is all audience Q&A with our guests. So our panel here, Blaine and Chris and myself, might have questions, but we're going to ask you, the audience, to submit your questions then. When that time comes, you can ask your questions in the comments of the Facebook video, or as always, I will be keeping an eye on the Gray Fossil Site Twitter and Instagram accounts. So if you can't leave a comment on Facebook, feel free to send us a message there.
All right, thank you, David. And of course, as usual, we have Dr. Chris Widga with us as well. And sorry, Chris, we're not talking about mammoths or mastodons today.
Bears are equally interesting. I like bears. I will not fall asleep in this one, I promise.
And it seems maybe that even Anneke is going to tell us that these bears weren't eating many of your proboscideans either.
That's okay. That's all right.
Like here in North America with our giant short-faced bear, which is not what we're talking about today, but these at least seem to have been scavenging or eating some of our mammoths and mastodons from time to time. And so, Anneke, the way we like to get started is by going into a little bit more about how you got into paleontology in the first place, sort of what took you down that path. I'll send out one reminder to everybody again in that we're coming to you from the Center of Excellence in Paleontology at Johnson City, Tennessee, East Tennessee State University, where we oversee the Gray Fossil Site and other paleontological research as well. But Anneke, if you could just sort of dive in with a little bit deeper introduction and tell us how you got interested in the first place and then what path you took to get to where you are today.
Oof, well, I don't know what got me interested in the first place. As long as I remember, I've been interested in the past, and I've always known that this is what I wanted to do. When I was younger, I didn't quite know the word paleontology yet, so I thought it was called archaeology, but it's all very similar. It's all about the past and trying to reconstruct what happened in the past. And I don't remember a time before wanting that. So I went to university in Utrecht and I did biogeology there, which is a combination between geology and biology. So you get a little bit of both. Then I did my PhD in London on the cave bear, and that topic never really let me go. So I keep trying to do other things, but I keep coming back to the cave bear. It keeps pulling me in. And then I did a couple of postdocs in other places, in Paris, in Bonn, a very short stint in Australia, and now I'm in Munich as a curator.
Right. You've traveled a lot more than many of us. Well, that's definitely exciting. And bears and cave bears, it just doesn't get much better than that for me. So we're all looking forward to hearing more about your research today. And if you wouldn't mind going ahead and sharing your screen.
Yes.
Oftentimes people associate the giant short-faced bear with being a cave bear, which it is not. And it did in some sense use caves to a certain extent, but nothing like the degree to which these cave bears were using caves in the old world. Some of these caves having just tens of thousands of individuals. It's just mind-blowing.
Can you see my screen now?
We can see it. We're all set. Go ahead.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for everybody that you're willing to listen to me talk about cave bears. They are called cave bears because we find them mostly in caves, both their bones, but there are also some, there's also some cave art about cave bears, and that's how we know, for example, that they were very boring brown. Like I said, usually found in caves, and that's because they sometimes accidentally died during hibernation, and they were hibernating in the cave. And then the cave has a very good environment for fossilization, so the bones stay preserved very well. We find cave bears all over Europe, and they were living there during the ice ages. The cave bear became extinct around 24,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum. So what did the cave bear look like? It was the largest animal that inhabited the mountains during the ice ages. Obviously, mammoths and such were bigger, but they were not living in the mountains. They were living on the plains. It's about the same size as the modern polar bear. It would be about 3.5 meters tall when standing up, so that's about 12 feet. The males weighed between 350 and 600 kilos, so that's around 800 to 1,300 pounds, and the females were only about 225 to 250 kilos, which is around 500 pounds.
So if we could look at what else you're showing on that screen there.
Yes.
You also got Arctodus.
Yeah, short-faced bear.
And then is that Arctotherium angustidens as well on there? Or I'm wondering.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, I think
this
so.
is not my own picture. I have to admit, you can see here that I got it from DeviantArt, so it's not my own picture, but there's a couple of extinct bears in there.
I think that's, so the one that's the largest is the Arctotherium angustidens, and then you have Arctodus simus. But I think one thing to point out when you're looking at those in comparison to the cave bear is the cave bears were really robust, weren't they? I mean, they really put on a lot of weight. And so even though the giant short-faced bear, that is that second one over, is really tall, it wasn't necessarily heavier than the cave bear.
No, probably not. And the cave bear's weight probably varied a lot throughout the year. I imagine that it would be really heavy in autumn going into hibernation and then coming out quite lean.
Right.
Right, so very recently, last summer 2020, some very interesting discoveries were made. They found a completely preserved ice age cave bear carcass in the permafrost with full soft tissue preservation. It was found by reindeer herders in Siberia in Russia. And it's not been dated, carbon dated yet, but they estimate it's between 22,000 and 40,000 years old. And this is going to be a wealth of information about the cave bear. So I'm really looking forward to all the studies that will be published on this bear. And they also found a cave bear cub, actually. So this is going to be very interesting and really tell us what the cave bear looked like rather than us just guessing from the bones. Now, before I get to the cave bear diet, we first need to understand what modern bears were eating. So here we see a black bear in a national park trying to get to the food storage of some poor human campers, because they essentially eat the same things we do. They are omnivorous and they will eat pretty much anything that fits in their mouths. Then there's also the panda, which is a herbivore, a plant eater. It only eats bamboo. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the polar bear, which is a pure meat eater, a pure carnivore. And there are also some bears with very specific adaptations, such as this Malayan sun bear, which has a very long tongue with which it can lick up insects. So all the modern bears, 8 species, have very different diets, which are depicted in images here. But what's important to take home from this image is that not all bears are equally related to each other. So we have the panda, which is the most distant cousin we have. It's split off from the other bears the earliest, around 21 million years ago. Then we have the spectacled bear that's split off. And then we have a group of bears that are all very closely related. Here we have the brown bear and the polar bear, which are the closest cousins of the cave bear. The last common ancestor of cave bears and brown bears was the Etruscan bear, which lived around 1.2 to 1.4 million years ago. And the immediate ancestor of the cave bear was Ursus deningeris. So then we're looking around here, which I'll also tell something about later on in the presentation. So the question that I'll try to answer is, was the cave bear a ferocious hunter that perhaps even hunted our ancestors, or was it a very peaceful animal walking around between the flowers? And my way of researching that is using functional morphology. So I look at where the muscles attach on the mandible and on the skull. And that tells me something about in which direction the muscles were pulling and what the animal was good at. Was it good at grinding things or slicing things with its teeth? What was it doing? And we're in luck. We've already seen that bears have very different diets, but as we can see here, they also have skulls that look very different. So this might very well have something to do with their diet. Now I need to somehow quantify the shape of these skulls and mandibles. And I do that with a microscribe. And this machine takes the X, Y, and Z coordinates of repeatable points on the skull and on the mandible. But I can't use these X, Y, and Z coordinates just like that because they're not comparable yet. So to explain what I do, and it's called geometric morphometrics, I'm stealing an example from Slice 2005 of gorilla shoulder blades, which is 2-dimensional, so it's a bit easier to understand. We have 5 landmarks that were taken on these photographs of a large number of gorilla shoulder blades, and the raw data will look something like this. It's quite messy and you can't really make sense of it. So you want to translate, move your landmarks around so that the center of the landmarks is at 0, 0, or at least at the same position. So the landmarks become a lot more comparable, as you can see. Then you want to scale the landmarks because we're interested in shape and not in size per se. And then we rotate the landmarks so that they are as close as possible to each other, as comparable as possible with each other. And once you've done that, you can use the X and Y, or in my case, X, Y, and Z coordinates, as you would normal measurements from your sliding caliper. So you can do normal statistics with them. And I have done that with, for example, the lower jaw of the cave bear. And what we find there is actually very interesting. So with these landmarks, I've done a partially squares analysis, which correlates the diet of modern bears with the shape of their mandible. And what we see here in blue is the phylogeny, so the relatedness of the bears. And we see that the panda evolved in this direction in morphospace. So this entire thing we call morphospace. And the panda evolved in this direction, which runs parallel to an increase of foliage in the diet. And when we look at the sloth bear and the Malayan sun bear, they evolved in this direction, which runs parallel to an increase in invertebrates and fruits in their diet. And the polar bear up here evolved in this direction, which is parallel to an increase in vertebrates in the diet. And then we've got a bunch of omnivores kind of hanging out in the middle. So this graph depicts quite well which animal was eating what. And when we look at the cave bear, it's actually quite close to the other omnivores. So you might be tempted into thinking that it was omnivorous. But when you look at the direction it evolved in, it runs parallel to the panda and to an increase in foliage in the diet. So the cave bear was clearly adapting to eating plant matter, plant leaves. And in terms of morphology, that means the following. So the polar bear, the meat eater, has a temporal muscle pulling towards the back of the skull, and we can see that the coronoid process is directed in that direction. The brown bear, the omnivore, the coronoid process is more straight, and the temporal muscle is pulling more upwards. And in the cave bear, it's completely straight, and the temporal muscle is completely pulling upwards. So we can tell from where they are in morphospace what they looked like and what that means for how they were chewing. And in this case, the polar bear is good at slicing things, and the cave bear is good at grinding things. So if we want to know how much foliage the cave bear actually had in its diet, we can do a regression analysis. In this case, not of the partial least squares scores, but of a principal component scores, which is a different analysis, but it works quite similar. And we can see here that the meat and insect eating bears have quite high PC1 scores, whereas the plant eating panda has quite low PC1 scores. And we can do a regression to see where the cave bear would plot theoretically. And this vertical line is the average PC score of the cave bear. And it plots quite close to the panda. So this also indicates it was eating a lot of foliage. And in fact, it was about 80%. If we do a phylogenetically corrected analysis, so if we take into account the relatedness of the bears, it's even more, it's close to 100% of leaves in the diet. I've not only looked at the cave bear itself, but I'm also interested in its ancestor to try and find out when this diet came about. Is it really just a cave bear, or was its ancestor also already eating plant matter? And in this principal component analysis, we find the insect eaters and the meat eaters with quite low PC1 values. We find the omnivores here in the middle, and the panda towards the right, with the cave bear also quite close to the panda. And here in blue, we have Denninger's bear, the ancestor of the cave bear. And it has a very similar diet to the cave bear. So quite likely this herbivorous diet already existed in the ancestor of the cave bear. I've not only looked at the mandibles, I've also looked at the skulls. We see the Asiatic black bear here towards the left, then the middle, the American black bear. Here we have the brown bear, and I've indicated their diets in percentages. And in blue, we see the amount of foliage in the diet, which increases as we go towards the right of the graph. So when we look at what the cave bear was eating, we find a range between around 20 to 60% of leaves in the diet. And that's a lot less than we found when we were looking at the mandible. So that's quite interesting. And I've also looked at the Denninger's bear skull morphology to find out what it was eating. And in this graph, I had a few more recent animals. So we see that the panda is over here, but the panda is also the one that was least related to the other bears, if we remember. And we have the spectacled bear over here, which was basically second in line, and then come the other bears. And as we go towards the cave bear, the bears are more and more related to the cave bear. So in fact, what we're looking at here is not so much diet, but probably much more phylogeny, so relatedness of the bears. And that makes sense because the mandible is devoted to chewing. So it's perfectly adapted to chewing, and whether you're slicing things or grinding things or whatever you need your mandible for. Whereas the skull is used for a lot of other things as well. You use it to smell, to see, to hear, it protects the brain. So it would make sense that the skull cannot adapt so easily to diet as the mandible could. And there's probably a lot of other signals in the skull morphology. So that teaches us that when we want to look at diet, it's better to look at the mandibles than to look at the skull. So that's my main research. And of course, it's interesting to know whether there's any other research out there that supports the view that the cave bear was herbivorous. So here we see a cave bear tooth row of the lower jaw. And when we compare that to an insectivore, so for example, the Malayan sun bear, we see that it's not a match. The molars are much too smooth. There are premolars that are very simple compared to this premolar, which has a lot of extra cusps and is essentially a molarized premolar. When we compare it to the polar bear, which is a meat eater, it's also not a match. The molars are much too smooth. The premolar is very thin and also helps with slicing the meat, so not at all similar to this premolar. When we look at the brown bear, we're starting to get close. We're seeing a lot of relief here that we also find here. There's a lot of little cusps. There's not quite as many here, but we're getting closer. And then when we compare it to the panda, which is our plant eater, I would say it's a perfect match. All the little cusps and all the relief we see here, we find back here. The fact that the premolar is molarized and has extra cusps is something we also find here in the premolars. So tooth morphology, as far as I'm concerned, also shows the cave bear was likely herbivorous. We can also look at tooth root morphology. And what we see there is that with, we're looking at the upper jaw here. So we have the canine, premolar, molars. And this is relative tooth root size. And with the, doesn't really matter whether you're an insectivore, an omnivore, or a carnivore, they all do very similar things. They have a large tooth root at the canine, small at the premolar, and slightly bigger towards the back, towards the molars. The panda does something completely different. It has a very small root at the canine, and the relative root size becomes bigger and bigger towards the back of the tooth row. So what is the cave bear doing? Well, it kind of does a mix. So it does the same thing as the bears it's closely related to in the front of the mouth. So the canine has a large root and the premolar a small one. But then the molars, towards the back of the tooth row, we see that tooth root size increases for the cave bear and is trying to approach the tooth root size of the panda. So here we also see that the cave bear was very clearly adapting to a more herbivorous diet. The difference being, of course, that the cave bears had only 1.5 million years to do so, and the panda 21 million years to do so. So obviously it's not quite there yet, but we can clearly see it's trying to go in the same direction. We can also look at tooth wear, and that shows us basically what the animal was eating in roughly the last 2 weeks, maybe before it died. And it's essentially little damages, little scratches and pits that our food cause on our tooth surface. And everybody who's eaten spinach that wasn't washed properly will know what I mean by that. And we can look at those teeth with an electron microscope and look at those tiny little damages and determine what they were caused by. And that was done by Jones and DeSantis. They looked at American black bears and brown bears, which both have a lot of pits, a lot of scratches, a lot of damage had been done to the tooth surface. And when we compare that to the cave bear, we see it looks very different. The cave bear has a lot of parallel scratches, couple scratches in a different direction, but no deep pits whatsoever. So based on this, we can say that at the very least, the cave bear was not eating the same thing the brown bears and the black bears were eating. So it was definitely not omnivorous. But was it herbivorous? Well, unfortunately, there was no panda in this study, but some other people, Papla in 2019, did analyze the panda. Unfortunately, it was on a different tooth, so it's not directly comparable, but it gives us a rough idea, and we see a lot of parallel scratches on the tooth surface of the panda, which I think is very comparable to the parallel scratches that we see here on the cave bear. So as far as I'm concerned, tooth wear also shows the cave bear was likely herbivorous and eating plants. Then there's another thing, another line of evidence, which is isotopes. So there's nitrogen and carbon in the atmosphere, and they have lighter and heavier versions of the same element. And when we eat and drink, we build those molecules or atoms into our bodies. And we can, in the fossils, look at the relationship between the heavier and the lighter versions. And that differs between whether you're a herbivore or a plant or a meat eater. So when we look at that, it becomes very interesting because what Richard et al. Found is that the cave bear had very high nitrogen values comparable to the wolf. And the wolf is not a pure carnivore. Wolves are hypocarnivorous. It means that they eat a lot of meat, but they actually eat a lot of other stuff too. And it's not at all comparable to the plant eaters like the deer that we see below here. So that might suggest that the cave bear was actually omnivorous, which is different from the results I found in my research. But there have been further studies. For example, Boscherat in 2018 did a very similar study, but with a much larger comparative sample size. All right, important to mention is that these bears are all from Romania. So they're from a very specific area. And the two Romanian cave bears plot here in this larger analysis, which is in fact very similar to the meat eaters in red in terms of nitrogen values, but it's also very similar to the mammoth, which is a very, well, I think we can all agree the mammoth was a plant eater. So the Romanian bears are not different from plant eaters, but they are different from all the other cave bears though, that are below here in purple. So there is something odd going on with these bears from Romania. I still think that based on the fact that even the weird ones from Romania plot with the mammoths, that cave bears were very likely herbivorous. But of course, we really want to test this. So this summer, actually, I'm going to be collaborating with Marius Rogu, who is in Romania, to work on these so-called omnivorous bears. There are over 20 mandibles from 3 different caves that I dare not pronounce, but they're on the screen. And I'm really looking forward to that. I'm very curious whether they're going to have a different mandible morphology, which might support that they had a different diet, or whether they have a very similar mandible morphology to the other cave bears that I've sampled. And perhaps that means that they had a different hibernation habit that might have caused a different nitrogen value. We don't know, but it's going to be very exciting research. So I'm really looking forward to that project. So does that mean that cave bears don't have anything to do with eating meat? Well, not really. We actually found quite a few cave bear remains with cut marks, which indicates that we were eating them rather than they were eating us. So it was the other way around. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, thank you. A lot to think about there. One of the things that right there at the end you touched on that I find, really fuels the imagination is whether or not people went in to hunt these bears while they were hibernating. And have there been studies showing that that was the case?
I don't think we know when they were hunted, but it would make sense because these bears were very large. They had huge canines, they had huge claws. So I wouldn't want to hunt it while it was awake and able to defend itself. If I was a Paleolithic hunter, I would want to do that while it was sleeping. And
Right. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I'm really curious about is, it seems with the isotopes, they should really narrow down what's going on. And maybe Chris could chime in too on this, but it just seems to me that you would eventually be able to determine their degree of carnivory or omnivory with that when you're comparing it with other taxa. Chris, is that right?
I have questions.
Okay.
Yeah, nitrogen isotope questions. So, and we got some questions also in the feed. So apologies to those of you that are out there that I may be stepping on your toes. But so are there kind of geographic or climate differences between the Romanian bears and your other bear samples that may mean that they're hibernating longer, or maybe some groups are hibernating or not hibernating? The reason I ask is because when you get, when you have an animal that's living off its fat stores for, months every year, then it looks like a carnivore. So it drives that
right, yeah, because you got the urea cycling and yeah.
Is that the cool word, catabolism? Is that catabolism when you're sort of eating yourself?
Yeah, I think that might be what it is. Yeah. I mean, do you have any evidence that they may be behaving differently, or that it's a really different environment that they may be adapting to differently?
I don't think there's really strong evidence for that yet, but that is in fact one of the theories, that their nitrogen values are so high because of the urea cycling and the fat, their own fat reserves that they use up. So that is one theory that I currently think is very likely, but I would like to test it by looking at their mandibles, of course. But I don't think that we have environmental data on such a small scale that we can really say, oh, the bears from this cave were exposed to winter temperatures that were this cold, and from that cave. As far as I know, we don't have data on such a small scale, so that's going to be tricky. But there's a lot to look at. Also, if they are exactly the same age, perhaps they have a different geological age, and climate had changed a little bit between those times. So there's a lot of details that we're going to have to look at.
These are just the lazy bears. Yeah, they're
maybe
they sleep longer. Yeah, I mean,
maybe. But I think all bears were hibernating, though. I don't think some were hibernating and some were not. As far as I know, or as far as we know as researchers at the moment, hibernation was obligatory, and they had their cubs during hibernation, just like some brown bears do. So they were all hibernating. The question is how long.
This will be a really interesting avenue of research for you, I think. I know my experience, and a lot of us who do isotopes, the more you sample, the more confusing and noisy your data sets get, and you get, oh, this is really interesting. So yeah, good luck.
Yeah. So I'm not at all experienced with isotopes myself. I do the morphology part, but I'm really looking forward to this collaboration and trying to match morphology with isotopes and doing the same analysis on the same specimens and see what that gives us.
I'm guessing your sample sizes, potential sample sizes, must be just extraordinary in the various museums and collections.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There's hundreds and hundreds of cave bear mandibles that you could measure. I think, if I remember correctly, I measured around 100 or 110 or something like that for my PhD thesis. They didn't all end up in all analyses, but I did do, if I may be so free, because she did tell me I could put some extra slides for it.
Oh yeah, of course.
So if I can share my screen again. Oh, can I go down? No, right. So these here on the right, they are all specimens just from the Alpine region. So I've done a lot of data collection everywhere in France and Germany, a little bit in Eastern Europe, not in Romania, unfortunately, but other places in Eastern Europe. And these are just from the Alps. So basically just mostly just from Austria. And you can already see that there's a lot of specimens there. And I was trying to look at intraspecific variation, actually, because I usually treat cave bears just as one big group, but there are people who think that there are different species in this group. And so that's why I was looking at intraspecific variation. And actually the only thing I found was a difference between the Gamsutzenhöhle and the Merkensteinhöhle, but they both have the same species or subspecies. They both have Ursus ingressus. So it's really strange that those caves would be different, even though they're supposed to have the same subspecies or species, depending on who you ask. And if I may say something about that, because I'm honestly not convinced at the moment they are different species. They might be if further research shows that they are. I'm very happy to change my mind. But the problem is it was based on two caves that were not very far from each other, only around 10 kilometers from each other, that both had only one haplotype in the one cave and one haplotype in the other cave. So they were clearly different lineages, and they could calculate that these lineages had been split off from each other. I forgot the exact date, but like so long ago that they must be different species by now, etc. The problem is that they only did mitochondrial DNA. And there's actually a very similar situation going on in Japan with the black bears there. You have two populations there that were separated from each other by a river for about a similar period of time as the cave bears were. And only about 9% of the individuals are of the haplotype belonging to the other population in these black bears. And they are the same species. They are even the same subspecies. They are Ursus tibetanus japonicus. So they are the same subspecies. And yet only 9% is of the other haplotype. And only males, because females are philopatric. They stay where they are, and it's the males that go out to try and find a mate somewhere else. And this study on the cave bears had very small sample sizes, so only 7 specimens for the one species and for the one cave, and only 9 specimens for the other cave. So if you do a little thought experiment and think about what are the chances that you would miss the other haplotype, let's say it's 9%, just like in the black bear and the cave bear was also 9%. What are the odds that you would miss the other haplotype if your sample size is only 7 specimens? And in fact, it turns out that the chance you would miss it is about 50%. So you've got a 50-50 chance of being wrong here. If you add to that only males have the different haplotype, but more than half of the individuals, even around 75% in Gamsuits and Höhle, for example, are females, because we have caves that are primarily inhabited by females and caves that are primarily inhabited by males. Then the odds of finding this other haplotype with such a small sample size, with presumably such a small number of animals that cross over, the chances of missing that other haplotype are so large that I am not at all convinced by this research. Now, if they start doing research on nuclear DNA and it shows that they are very different, I'm willing to change my mind on that. But for the moment, I am not yet convinced.
I think with the size of these collections, because they are just mind-boggling, if we can't figure out what's going on with these bears, what can we figure out? Because Greg McDonald asked the question earlier. I was going to ask. He wondered whether or not there are any coprolites, if there's any scat, from these caves of these bears that have been found.
No, I don't think so. But of course, we now have the frozen specimens that might still have something in their colons. So there's an opportunity there.
I also wonder, because I don't follow the isotope research that much with the brown bears, for example, has there been, maybe Chris, too, has there been a study that's looking at sort of the broad range of brown bears today to look at how their modern isotopes might vary, because their diets do vary quite a bit over space?
I'm just trying to think. I don't think there, as far as I know, there hasn't been a comparative study. I think they've done isotopes on this population, and another researcher has done isotopes on that population, usually on hares, as far as I know, but I don't think there's been a comparative study. But I don't know, maybe Chris knows better.
I don't. Unfortunately, I'm lucky if I can keep up on the isotope literature with big herbivores and mammoths and mastodons and that sort of thing. And bears there's just so much coming out these days. But one of the cool things I think about your study, Anneke, is really that tension between isotope data, which is giving us, daily, weekly, maybe monthly, or an average of a year of a bear's life in a dietary signature, versus morphology. And I don't know if you have a feeling on kind of what is the time lag. So if you have a shift in diet in bears or in a population of bears, how long will it take for that mandible to start looking like it's an herbivore if it's a shift towards herbivory?
Oof, that's difficult to answer, obviously. I mean, we know that the last common ancestor of brown bears and cave bears lived around 1.2 million years ago. And that ancestor was presumably omnivorous, although that's more of a guess. But if that was the case, then the cave bear evolved its adaptations within about 1 million years, maybe, maximum.
A similar question about morphology, sort of what Chris is getting at there, is, with the giant panda and their extreme level of specialization with all of these cusps and the really large teeth and the unusual cranium that goes along with that, they are this extreme case. And so I'm wondering what happens to your data set if you take them out. Do you still sort of get this clear and separate herbivorous picture of the cave bear? If you've done any thought on that, or what happens if you take the panda, this sort of extreme specialist, out of the scenario?
Well, then it becomes a lot more difficult to compare, obviously, because then we don't have any herbivores left in the reference data set. So how am I supposed to, at best I can say the cave bear is doing something else from all the other bears, but it's going to be very hard to say that it's herbivorous. But I did have one slide with the skulls, if I can share my screen again.
I guess another way to ask that is, besides the ascending ramus, the coronoid and the direction of the coronoid, what other morphological aspects then would you say sort of jump out in the lower jaw as being the signature of the herbivore?
The position of the masseter as well. The masseter muscle changes. The mandible becomes deeper. I think more curved as well. So it's not so much straight like scissors, but it becomes more curved.
Cool. That's what I was hoping you would say, because I'm thinking about these bears, these short-faced, some of these short-faced bears that we're getting from the Yucatan. So we'll talk about that soon too.
But the short-faced bears, I thought, were generally thought to have been carnivorous.
Right? So that's right. But there are other types, and so what we're going to do is we can talk about in the future some of these other types. So Arctodus, on one hand, is in some cases appears to have been more carnivorous in the northwestern parts of its range, but isotopes really haven't been done across space. And then Arctotherium, which is more of your South American variant coming up into the Yucatan, has something very different going on. And then the spectacled bear is actually primarily an herbivore to omnivore. And so I think that there's going to be some fun games to play in the comparisons of these directions.
True, but the problem there is, hold on, I'll show it. Oops.
We should get to some of the questions of the audience, because we do have a lot, I think, coming in.
Yeah,
we have a lot coming in.
Oh dear. I hope they're not too difficult.
You can just say pass. That's cool. Right.
So if I can just very quickly, because we were talking about the mesenteric fossa as well, and the diet of the short-faced bears. The problem with the short-faced bears is that they have this pre-mesenteric fossa, which pushes the mesenteric fossa back as compared to the cave bear here in red. And so it's going to be a lot more tricky to do a similar analysis and pop. I mean, you were talking about what happens if I remove the panda. Actually, I should be removing the spectacled bear because it has this extra morphological feature messing things up. So it's going to be tricky to do the same morphological analysis with these short-faced bears.
All right, we may have to tweak it. Well, we can come back to that discussion, but I know, David, you probably have quite a few questions building up.
Yeah, we've got tons of questions that have come in to our Facebook comments. So anyone who hasn't already, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. We'll get through as many of these as we can. I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them, so apologies in advance. Let's start with this one by our friend Chris Jazz, who asked, is there a relationship between the distribution of certain types of vegetation and the distribution of cave bears? Was availability of vegetation a limiting factor in their distribution?
So it doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, they've even found cave bears so high up in the mountains that there shouldn't have been any vegetation there, really. So we think that they were moving up to their favorite caves, even if there wasn't anything to eat there, which is fine, because when you're hibernating, you don't need to eat anyway. But it doesn't really seem that vegetation was a limiting factor, much more caves. So, for example, the Netherlands is very flat. There are no caves there, and there are not really any cave bears there. I think there's one or two specimens where there's a lot of discussion whether it is a cave bear or not, but they're not present in the Netherlands the way they are in Germany or in the Alps, simply because there's no place for them to hibernate.
All right, and we've got a question from Sarah, who's asking about social behavior. So you mentioned that females and males might be behaving differently. Sarah's asking, what do we know about the social behavior of these bears, and how do we know?
Well, we don't really know that much because social behavior doesn't fossilize very well. So we know that the males and the females were hibernating in different caves, because we can tell by the skeleton and by the skull size and the canine size whether it's male or female. So we know that some caves were preferred by one or the other sex. But we really don't know much more than that. I mean, we don't know if they were grazing in herds or whether they were solitary animals, because that kind of behavior doesn't fossilize. So we can only look at modern bears and look at what they are doing. And there's really nothing more that we can do.
I have a question that is also being asked here by Grant Boardman. And whether or not anybody has done any bone histology on cave bears, and whether or not that bone histology might show evidence of hibernation.
Ooh, there has been some bone histology. I'm just trying to think what the exact results were. I don't think they could show hibernation per se, but you have these yearly lines that can tell you how old the animal is, but you also find them in animals that don't hibernate. So of course, in bears, it makes sense to think that these yearly lines where growth slows down take place during hibernation. But because we also find similar lines in reindeer or in deer, it's not evidence of hibernation.
Right, it can be just a seasonal indicator, basically, of a stress.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that I've had in the past is whether or not you could use that as an indicator in bears, in some cases, determine whether they're hibernating or not hibernating. With these ones that are dying in the caves, it seems like that would be an obvious potential test to see how it might look in other bears. So just curious.
Then you probably have to look at, I think for brown bears, hibernation is facultative. So you could compare brown bears from more southern areas where they don't hibernate with brown bears that do hibernate. And maybe you do find a difference in terms of how strong these lines are. I'm not even sure if modern bears have these lines, because I'm talking about deer and stuff from the ice ages, which had harsh winters. And I don't even know if
Right.
modern deer would show the same thing.
Yeah, and our discussion was about trying it with black bears in North America, because they have such a large distributions, with ones hibernating in the north, but not so much in the south. But just curious if you knew about that, and I don't either. So.
Yeah.
We've got a question here from Greg, who asks, is there any indication of Bergman's law in cave bears?
I don't think there's a size difference going north to south, but there are size differences going from higher up in the mountains to lower in the plains. So they're actually quite a bit smaller high up in the mountains, and they are larger, the ones that are lower and on the plains. So there are size differences, but not exactly Bergman's law.
All right, and now here's a question from Stephen. How much wear-related secondary morphology do you get in bears, and can those wear patterns cause problems with taxonomic identification? Pointing out that this is a big problem with proboscideans.
So are we talking about the teeth here, or do you mean that when the teeth wear down, mandible shape changes because the occlusion changes? I'm not quite sure what the question is exactly.
The question doesn't specify, so go with both.
Go with both. Oh dear.
Can the wear patterns from diet affect morphology and thus impact taxonomic identification? Is what the question is getting at.
So I think that macro wear, so that means really wearing down the teeth rather than the micro wear that we looked at before, that should change the morphology of the mandible. And we do find that older bears tend to have much more pronounced markings of where the muscles were attaching. But whether that's really due to the fact that the teeth are worn, or whether that's more just due to age, that's of course hard to determine, because they go hand in hand. The older you get, the more tooth wear you have. but it's not a problem with identification. So you can still recognize the teeth, especially the molars and the premolars. The incisors are very similar in all bears, so please don't give me an incisor and ask me to say which bear it is. But in terms of the molars, they are quite recognizable even when they're worn. So that's not much of a problem.
All right, and now going back a bit to you and Blaine were talking about pandas and modern herbivorous bears. Ethan asks, does the fact that the most herbivorous bear today, pandas, does the fact that pandas eat such a weird plant present any interpretive problems? Presumably most fossil bears weren't eating bamboo, or maybe they were. You know, is it a problem that pandas are very specialized for what kind of plants they're eating?
It is, but we don't have any grass-eating bears or any leaf-eating bears, so it's the best we've got. But yes, it's a problem because obviously the cave bear was not eating bamboo. We don't have any of that in Europe where it was living, so it's a problem, but it's not one that's easily solved, so we have to make do with what we have.
All right, a question from Dick, who asks, how was the mummified carcass from Siberia identified as a cave bear? If it is a cave bear, it's the most northern one in Eurasia. Why don't we have them in the northern Americas?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not part of the research team that studies this frozen bear, so I can't tell you how they've determined that, to be honest. But there is a little bit of an issue that we're actually not quite sure whether these Asian cave bears are the same lineage cave bears as in Europe. It could be. This is very speculative, so this is not, I can't support this really with any, but it could be that the Asiatic black bear lineage has undergone a similar transition as the brown bear lineage has, in terms of both had the group split off and become more herbivorous. So it could be parallel evolution, and there's so few specimens in Asia that it's very difficult to determine. I've not measured any of the specimens myself. I've only seen a cast once of one of those Asian bears. So, but you're right, you know, we don't know for sure whether this is the same cave bear we find in Europe. I don't know how they determined this. There's no scientific studies that have come out yet. So all we have is the press releases and what the media writes. So at the moment, I can't be 100% sure, but I hope it is a cave bear because it would be very interesting.
All right, I'm going to go with one more here, and then we'll see if Blaine or Chris have anything else they want to add. The account, Miracle of Wildlife, says, studying modern brown bears, the biggest have more meat in their diet. How could cave bears get so big just on vegetation?
Well, how could mammoths get so big just on vegetation? I don't know. If you eat enough, I suppose you can get quite far with that. I mean, I don't see that as a problem. You just need to eat enough and be adapted enough to digest it. And it could very well be, but again, this doesn't fossilize, that the cave bear had a different gut flora from modern brown bears. So it was much better at eating or digesting plant matter than modern brown bears are. So it could become that big just living on plant matter. But, you know, it doesn't fossilize, but that's something that perhaps they could find in these frozen animals. They could probably look at the gut microbiota and see if there's any differences there. But that's all in the future. That's not something we know now.
All right, well, this has been a great discussion and lots of questions. There are tons more in the comments, but we are about at our end here. So I'm going to open it up to Blaine and Chris if you guys have anything else you want to say.
And I'll work with you, Anneke, to answer some of these questions that are on Facebook, because I know you're not doing Facebook. So I'll send you some of those questions later and we can work on some of those. But yeah, just really interesting. I think it's fascinating that we don't know everything about the cave bear and that we still have so much to learn about a species that is so common. And, you know, I can't help but also wonder, as more genetic work is done, how much crossing there is between some of these different bears over time, because we're getting surprised by some of these other lineages, both with canids and with bears, on the fact that, yeah, they didn't really stick with our categories all the time.
No. Cave bears and brown bears were definitely mixing, just like modern humans and Neanderthals were. You know, just species boundaries are very artificial. I think we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Chris, you have any final questions or comments?
Well, no, it's fascinating work, Anneke. And, you know, the cave bears kind of are like some of these other animals that you just have huge samples of. And so there's so much potential to kind of tease apart these really interesting questions. So good luck to you.
Thanks.
I have one final question. Tell me, where are the cave bears today? Like, if I wanted to go see a ton of cave bears at a museum, where would you go? What is like the main place that has a ton of cave bears? Is there?
There is no main place.
Yeah. But there's a lot in England?
No, not so much.
Really?
No.
Really?
You're better off going to Austria, to Vienna. Either the Natural History Museum there or the university there has a lot in Vienna.
I want to go to Vienna. Okay, that's perfect. You don't have to say anymore.
Okay.
I'm looking for a good trip for the future, so that's perfect. Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And thank you, David and Chris, as well. Great having you.
It was very nice being here. Thank you.